I think the big picture is that God gave us the gift of emotion. You know, we are not told to suppress, emotion in the sense that we are told to respond to our emotions. First of all, you have to understand what emotions are. Emotions are a physical response to what we either what is true or what we believe to be true. For example, if you're standing there and we're having a conversation, I had a plastic snake in my pocket. I wouldn't do this to you, by the way. But if I threw it down there in front of you and you believed that plastic snake was real, what emotion would you respond with? Fear, right? Even though it's not real, your response, emotions are a response, you respond to what you think is true with that emotion of fear. And so emotions are, in that sense, a response. They should not govern, but rather they should respond to what we believe or know to be true. So that's where we are not to live by our emotions. It's interesting, when you look at the New Testament, I challenge you to read it and think about how often feelings and people living by feelings is recorded in the New Testament. They're always unbelievers. Believers are governed by what we know to be true about God from His Word. And that governs our lives. So think of it this way. Emotion should never be the engine of your Christian life. The engine of your Christian life is what you know from the Scriptures. Your emotions are the caboose. They're to follow. They're to be drawn along. So you don't try to drive a certain emotion. Your emotion responds to what you know to be true. So if you want to rejoice, you can't just sort of work up joy. I'm just going to be joyful. No, that's artificial. You have to think about the truth. You have to think about, I love what Jesus says. I think it's in Luke 10:20, where the disciples come back from their missions trip, and they're talking about all the stuff that Christ empowered them to do. And he says, okay, that's great. He says, but don't rejoice that the demons are subject to you. Rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Just think about that for a moment. Your name, Christian, is written in heaven. Now, what's your response to that? What's your emotional response when you understand that truth? It fills you with joy if you believe that, if that's you. And so our emotions respond to that. And so I think that's a very simple answer to a complex issue, but I think you need to let your mind drive your emotions and not your emotions drive your life. And so think about the truth to correct emotions. Emotions will eventually follow as you speak the truth to yourself. Some cases, because we're two-part beings, emotions can be somewhat physically caused. They can be, I know I'm a pretty stable person, but at one point somebody recommended that I take melatonin for sleep. And I took melatonin, and I'm like moping around all day, every day. It's like, what's wrong with me? I've never been like this in my life. So sometimes there can be physical components that shape and direct our emotions, things we're going through physically. So it's more complicated. But I'm just saying, don't let your emotions be the engine. Let them follow what you know to be true about God. And when you have emotions, let them drive you to respond appropriately to God. What does James say? He says, is anyone among you joyful? Let him sing songs. Let your emotions drive you back to God. You see that in the Psalms, right? When the psalmist is struggling, what is he doing? He's pouring out his heart before God when he's struggling emotionally, and you see that laid out in the Psalms. And when he's filled with joy, what's he doing? He's expressing that in praise. So those would be the main things I would say, but understand the big picture, and that is that for the Christian, our minds comprehending and understanding God's truth is what is to drive everything. And sometimes our emotions follow that. Other times it may take a while, or there may be a physical component, but don't live in your emotions. It doesn't matter what you feel. Your feelings could be wrong, like the snake illustration. That you may be feeling fear when you don't need to feel fear. So it's back to what I've always said, and that is preach the truth to yourself. Just don't listen to yourself. Talk to yourself. That's Lloyd Jones, right? And I love that book too. But don't listen to yourself. Talk to yourself. Preach the truth to yourself. And that's how your mind changes. And often, not always because there are other factors, but often your emotions will follow as you do that. But regardless, you still believe the truth, regardless of what your emotions are telling you. In fact, there are times, and I've shared this with you, there are times when you just have to say to your emotions, shut up. You know, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna do what's right. And I think it was it Elizabeth Elliot who said, you know, some dispositions, some emotions don't go by praying, they go by kicking. You know, and sometimes that's exactly what's required. But let them, regardless, drive you back to God.